Hi guys! Today we are going to be making shepherd's pie. The recipe that I'm going to be following is by Alton Brown. So here you can see I have tomato paste, all-purpose flour, and I also have a bag of potatoes, just yellow potatoes. Then I've opted to use ground hamburger instead of lamb. I also have Worcestershire sauce, canola oil, butter, pepper, salt, and an egg. First things first, I'm going to fill a stock pot with nice cool water, and I will be putting chopped and diced potatoes in there to boil and then mash, and that will be the topping for the shepherd's pie. So here I have my potatoes. The recipe technically called for 1.5 pounds of russet potatoes, but I had yellow potatoes that I needed to use up, so I opted to use those instead. And to be honest, it probably doesn't make that big of a difference, so use whatever potatoes you end up having on hand. Unless they're baked potatoes, that probably wouldn't work so well. So right now I'm just going to be peeling them. I made sure to give them a nice scrub before peeling them. If you don't wash them, it could dull your knife, it could dull your peeler. So please be sure to rinse off your potatoes and do a good job before you start preparing them. I also like to have a little mixing bowl on hand to keep all of my peelings and anything produce related, or really any kind of refuse to collect, so that I don't have to keep running back and forth to the garbage. So here you can see that I am just chopping up these potatoes. I'm chopping them into approximately 1/2 inch pieces. Essentially you just want them to be evenly sized so that they cook evenly. If they're all different sizes, they're going to cook at different rates, and it's going to make it a little bit hard for you in the long run. So try to get nice even pieces. So once that's done, you can go ahead and add that to the stock pot. Technically you want to put all of that on the stovetop at the same time, so the potatoes in cool water. This water actually was a little bit warm when I put the potatoes in. Ultimately, it will probably be fine, and it really didn't affect the end product, so it's okay. As you can see, I had a little bit too much water. You really just want enough water just to kind of cover the potatoes while they boil. So I'm just taking a little bit of excess water out with a measuring cup. So while the potatoes are going to boil, I am going to prepare my other vegetables that will be part of the gravy and protein base. So I have 2 medium to large carrots that I'm going to peel here. Then I have a whole Vidalia onion. I have minced garlic and a garlic clove that I will also be mincing. And then I also have rosemary and thyme. So basically what I'm going to do is just make sure that all of my vegetables are prepped, and then I'm going to chop whatever needs to be chopped so that we're ready to make the gravy base. So after I've peeled the onions, I'm going to move on to cutting and peeling after peeling the carrots, I'm going to move on to peeling the onion. The recipe didn't really specify the type of onion that you would use, but I think that sticking with a sweeter, less acidic onion works better to complement the gravy. So Vidalia it is. Then I'm going to move on and I'm going to prepare my garlic. Editing Andy would like to note here that I could have saved myself a whole lot of time if I actually smashed the garlic first, but you'll see in a little bit that I decided to do that later for whatever reason. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut up my carrots. I cut them in half first, and then I will quarter them, and I will chunk them up. And again, I want to kind of keep them on the smaller side because they'll cook a little bit faster, and we want to try and reduce the amount of time that this is going to take. So you can see here that I'm chopping them pretty small, all things considered. And here I can show you how I did things dreadfully out of order. So after peeling it the hard way, I decided that I would smash it. but that's okay. So now I am going to go ahead and mince this garlic clove. So I have fresh garlic in this recipe as well as pre-minced garlic. And I really did take my time to make sure that I minced it nice and well so that it could really bring out the nice sweet flavor that garlic has when you cook it. After that, I am going to go ahead and chop up my onion. So of course you want to be very mindful and very careful about cutting things in this manner. I find that this is the easiest way to get a nice even dice on my onions, so I prefer to cut my onions this way, but please make sure that you are being safe and watching your fingers when you cut anything. And I also try to make sure that I use as much of the produce as possible, so you can see that I have just flipped the onion and have continued to chop it so that I can get as much off of the root as possible. And here I'm just going to give another rough chop just to get rid of any kind of larger chunks that may have snuck in. So I had previously already prepared the thyme. Thyme leaves are pretty small, so they didn't really need a whole lot, but here I'm preparing the rosemary. So rosemary looks a lot like pine needles, I think, and it always reminds me of Christmas. The smell never fails to remind me of Christmas. So obviously, because these are larger, you want to give it a good chop so that you don't just get these big, long pieces of rosemary. So the potatoes are boiling away, and what you're going to do is you are going to then drain them, make sure that they are nice, well, and drained. That is, of course, after double checking and making sure that they're cooked properly. So if you just stick a fork in the potatoes and it gives easily, then it means that your potatoes are done. But if they're still a little bit firm, you probably want to wait and cook them a little bit longer. So at this point, I am starting a new pan where in 2 tablespoons of canola oil, I'm going to be sweating out and softening up the carrots and the onions. Here I am draining the potatoes, so I double checked and even the largest chunks were nice and cooked through. So while they're draining, I'm going to take a mixture of half and half in butter and then just very kind of quickly microwave it to make sure that they're melted together. And what will end up happening is that when you go to mash your potatoes, you're going to pour that mixture in there to add a little bit of richness and depth of flavor. So now that they're well drained, you're going to add the potatoes back into the stock pot. Then you are going to pour the half and half mixture with butter over top of it and then smash them right up. So you want them really nice and creamy. You don't want any big chunks. And then don't forget to season your potatoes. So it might just be the topping, but I think it's really important in cooking to make sure that you flavor at every opportunity. So I'm just adding some salt and pepper here, and I'll mash it again, I'll stir it around, and then I taste test it a couple of times to make sure that it's not over seasoned, but that it still does have flavor that it can add to the final shepherd's pie. So once I'm done with that, I'm going to set them to the side. Then I'm going to go back to my vegetables. I'm going to add the minced garlic here, and you can see that the onions have become translucent and that the carrots are more tender, and that's what you're looking for. Then I'm going to add the ground meat. And essentially what you're going to want to do is just to cook the meat until it's browned and it's not raw anymore. And then don't forget to season here too. I actually ended up not being totally happy with how well the filling was seasoned at the very end, but I found that by topping the shepherd's pie with some garlic salt, it really helped pull it together. But here you can see I did in fact add some seasoning to the filling. It just wasn't quite enough when I got to the end. So here you can see the meat has been browned, so at this point I'm adding flour to help create that gravy base. So the flour acts as a thickening agent to create a kind of roux, so that the filling becomes less liquidy and a little bit more thick. So you just want to make sure that you stir it well so that the meat gets coated and can start absorbing the liquid. Then after that I'm adding in the tomato paste, the Worcestershire sauce, and the chicken stock. And you'll see that here in a minute I'm going to also be adding the herbs. So once all of that's added, I'm just going to give it a nice stir and make sure that everything's incorporated so that there aren't any chunks of tomato paste floating about and that everything is evenly distributed. And here, because I love it, we're just going to appreciate the way that the filling is bubbling on the stovetop as everything incorporates and the flavors marry. So just before I'm going to put it in the casserole dish to bake, I'm going to add the frozen peas and frozen corn. So ultimately they're going to cook through while they're in the oven baking, so I just really added this at the very end and then stirred to make sure that they were distributed throughout the mixture. But because the mixture was pretty hot from the stovetop, they'll defrost pretty quickly. So here I am adding the filling to the 13 by 9 baking dish, and once I get everything in there I am going to just make sure that it's in one nice even layer. So now that my filling is in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start adding the potato, and this is where it actually starts to become a pie. So I go around the edges first to make sure that the edges are sealed, that way the filling won't bubble over into the oven while it's baking. And there was a point when I thought, oh man, this is a lot of potatoes. I really hope that everything fits in this baking dish. And while it did just fit into the baking dish, it was actually just enough potatoes. So I'm just going through and making sure that the edges are nice and sealed and that everything is smooth. So all this time I had preheated the oven to about 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and I placed the baking dish on a baking sheet so that if anything did bubble over it would be caught and not go onto the burner. And you are going to want to bake it for 25 minutes or until the potatoes are golden brown. Mine were not as golden brown as they could have been. I could have put additional egg wash on, or I could have even broiled the casserole or the shepherd's pie for a few minutes to get that lovely brown crust, but it was delicious regardless. So then you just want to let it cool for 10 to 15 minutes before serving. So here you can see that the filling is just bubbling around the edges, but it didn't overflow, which is perfect. And here we are. So I'm going to give myself a nice healthy portion, and I did actually have a couple of servings. I was really pleased with how it came out. Like I said, I did end up adding garlic salt to the very end because I thought that it was just missing a little bit of seasoning, but that ended up being the perfect thing. And I am such a foodie, I needed to make sure that whatever was part of that serving was definitely getting on my plate. So I'm nothing if not thorough in that regard. And here we have the final result. So I really enjoyed this. I hope that you did too, and maybe we'll bake and cook again together another time. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!